evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to D.G. Wills Books in La Jolla, California. Tonight we're honored to have Professor Amelia Glaser, who's reading from two different books of Ukrainian poetry. First one is written by Halina Kruk. It's a crash course in Molotov cocktails. And the second book is written by Lyudmila Khersonska. Today is a Different War. A Crash in Molotov Cocktails is a guidebook to the emotional combat in Ukraine. These stunning poems of witness by one of Ukraine's most revered poets, Today is a Different War, is also a striking portrayal of life from inside war-torn Ukraine. Lyudmila Khersonska is a poet and translator from Odessa. She's the author of four poetry collections in Russian, and she was recently included in the list 33 international women writers who are bold for change by Words Without Borders. Professor Amelia M. Glaser translates primarily from Yiddish, Ukrainian, and Russian. She is professor of literature at UCSD, where she holds the chair in Judaic Studies. Her books include Jews and Ukrainians in Russia's Literary Borderlands, and she is currently working on a book about contemporary Ukrainian poetry. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Amelia M. Glaser.
Hey, Dennis, thank you so much for having me. I think the last time I read in this bookstore was, I don't know, it was like a decade ago when my first book came out, Jews and Ukrainians, and here we are. Thinking about Ukraine a lot, and there is a different audience in part because it's a different focus on Ukraine from the one that I had when I wrote my first book. When I was thinking about the 19th century, I was thinking about Nikolai Gogol, whose birthday it is today, in fact. Oh, wow. And now I have shifted gears completely, and I'm thinking about the 21st century, which is really, really kind of exciting for me, although it's for a difficult reason. I've been focusing on Ukrainian poets since about 2014, since the outbreak of the war in Donbass. And my colleague Yulia Ilchuk and I had been translating together. We started translating around 2014, 2015. We needed to do it out of necessity because Serhii Zhadan came to visit California, both UCSD, where I teach, and Stanford, where she teaches. And we needed to quickly get some poems into English for our students. And we realized that we translated well together. And so we continued to do it. And then when the pandemic happened, we realized that it was actually becoming kind of a lifeline for us. We would meet on Zoom late at night for me, early in the morning for her. She was living in Kyiv at the time on sabbatical right when the pandemic hit. And Yulia and I kind of just translated. It was the only thing we could really emotionally tolerate during the pandemic. And then when the invasion happened, we had this store of Ukrainian poems that we'd been translating into English together, and realized that rather than sitting on them for some kind of future enormous volume, it was time to begin to publish them. So I'm very, very grateful to Askold Melnichuk, who is the editor of Aerosmith Press, which has just put out 3 books of Ukrainian poetry. Askold and I met when I was on sabbatical last year in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he immediately said, let's collaborate on something. Why don't you translate a book of poems for me? And this is how the Halina Kruk book was born. Yulia and I had been translating Kruk's work for a few years, and this was our big chance to really do a kind of deep dive into her oeuvre. But she has also translated something for Aerosmith Press. Very quickly, she edited this volume of poems translated by Lyudmila Khersonskaya. Khersonskaya is a poet writing in Russian. She lives in Ukraine, she lives in Odessa, but she writes in the Russian language. And I got to meet her in 2019 when I was visiting Odessa for a conference. I went over to her house for tea. She's married to another great Ukrainian poet in Russian, Boris Khersonsky, and the three of us sat there together and drank tea and discussed the war. And a few months later, we were all on lockdown and just communicating virtually. But I'm really excited that Lyudmila, who's sometimes lived a bit in the shadows of her older and already very famous spouse, her very wonderful, very subtle poetry is being recognized. So I'll read a few things by her. And then finally, I want to just introduce the third book. This is a book that was edited by the wonderful Ilya Kaminsky, whom Dennis just mentioned, used to be at San Diego State, and it was so wonderful to have him in San Diego. But he's moved on to Princeton, where he's teaching, and he and Carolyn Forche, a poet and an editor, have put together this volume of poems and excerpts of poems, also with Aerosmith Press, in The Hour of War, which, all three of them were kind of siblings. They came out together. I want to begin this reading actually by reading a couple of things from this book by Ilya and Carolyn. And I have a few translations in here, both Yulia and I. Yulia and I tend to translate well together. She is a native speaker of both Russian and Ukrainian, so she handles the accuracy. And I'm a native speaker of English, so we work well together in that sense. And we're actually in the midst of translating another book, probably with Harvard University Press, of the work of Iya Kiva, another really phenomenal poet from Ukraine. And we have a couple of poems by Iya in this volume. But I thought I would begin actually by reading a translation that's not my own, but that was done by Ilya Kaminsky, the co-editor of this volume, and his partner, Katie Ferris. My children just arrived in time for the first poem. This is a poem by Ostap Slivinsky, a poet living in Lviv, and I do not have the original here. I'll just read it in the English. It starts with a little quote from Katerina Kalitko, yet another poet from Ukraine. And the quote is, "It's easier now that the war has started." The poem is called Between Hate and Love. Between hate and love, once a forest towered and houses, no trees now, fire, no buildings. Between love and hate, see us, we walk upright. Clarity is so instant that not everyone remembers to shut their eyes. Many lie down, blinded, in the gardens on the outskirts. Those who remain see their lips as if by honey sealed, repeating words of love only and hate. Yes, we are envoys of a flat earth. Our only vocabulary is antonyms. Those who wait for nuances from us, those who arrive here to click color photos, forgive us. Your efforts will go waste as all our gathering of stones. Our public panels at the low table lit by the lights of the stage. Forgive us. Here is our x-ray. Skeletons and skin. We carry nothing else at the moment. Again, that's a poem by Ostap Slivinsky, translated by Katie Ferris and Ilya Kaminsky. And among other things, Ostap Slivinsky is actually one of the poets. There's kind of been a different approach, and I think it depends really on sensibility, but also on where you are in Ukraine. Some people have been writing a lot since the war broke out. It's like their only outlet. It just flows out of them, and it's been amazing to see this happen. Others, like Ostap, have sort of been silent. And Ostap, rather than writing poetry over the last year, he has been doing interviews. He actually started by just volunteering. He lives in Lviv on the far west of the country, and he's been volunteering by going to train stations and other things with refugees that are coming from the east. And he'll just ask them questions like, what have you seen lately? And he noticed that in the answers, people are starting to use words differently. They would talk about the word, plum tree. And instead of it meaning, a fruit-bearing tree, it would be a metaphor for death, because there was a plum tree that, was going to be chopped down, and an old woman, stood in front of it with her body, and so the woman was shot. And so he's been collecting what he calls a Slovnik Viny, a war dictionary or war glossary, and that's just coming out in about a month in Ukrainian, where it's just interviews with people about words and how war changes language. So something that I want to just have you bear in mind is the way that language itself sometimes is affected by war, by a state of war. I'll read another from this collection before moving on. This is another poem that Yulia and I translated. This appeared on LitHub. We were very lucky in that on the very first day of the invasion a year ago, I just, was in touch with a colleague who said, "Aren't you going to publish some Ukrainian poems already? Like, you've been stocking them up, or what are you waiting for? Here's the name of my editor at LitHub. Why don't you send him something?" And I wrote, on the 24th to this guy at LitHub, and he immediately published some of Iya Kiva's poems. And then about every month for the last year, we, on and off, have published things with LitHub, and it's been kind of cool to see these names become more familiar to English language readers. This is a poem by Mariana Savka. who is a poet also from the west of Ukraine, from Lviv, who is also a publisher, a really important publisher in Ukraine. Here lies the Lord, slain in a coffin. The resurrection, it seems, is off schedule. He was a volunteer in the last, most terrible war, drove around the city so calm, unarmored, delivered bread through the hellish traffic, told those around him, don't live in anger. After all, even a horrible criminal has a chance of repenting. But the sun was setting over the city, behind the hills, black ridges, and the buildings were burning like dry masts, and the fight between the light and the dark might last a while. He was struck down by a fragment of a missile to the chest. Beside him lay 12 others, a child among them. A good 50 people quickly surrounded them, and they said, Herods, spare no one, not even kids. But they soon left because it was already curfew. Here lies the Lord. He was kind. He divided the bread. He came from somewhere, from Izium, from Bucha, from Popasnia. He's lying in a coffin. We're awaiting the wonder of wonders. He asked us not to kill. He walked here among us. He will rise again, casting off his cross and vulnerability. He will rise again and will join our ranks, desperate, brave, familiar, alive. This was published to Facebook, because Facebook is where a lot of poets will publish in Eastern Europe on Easter last year, 2022. And the last poem I'd like to read from this particular book, this collection by Carolyn and Ilya, is a poem by Iakiva, also translated by me and Yulia Ilchuk, called The Labyrinth. You get a sickly short haircut, as if preparing your head for something horrible, more horrible than life, than death, than war. For all the things you can't imagine, for all the things you won't remember. Because in this country, fear has nowhere to hide. No shelter, no crack, no corner in the labyrinth of memory. So an exhausted minotaur awaits the Theseus on that perfectly formed Greek vase. I should probably have a kind of trigger warning. I think you, by coming to a contemporary Ukrainian reading, you already realize that these are hard poems to hear sometimes, and also hard poems to read. And I understand if it becomes sort of overwhelming. I'll try to break things up a little bit with older poems. So I'll read now from this volume. This is the volume that is just hot off the press. I think it's officially not even the publication date. Is that right? But it's here we have it, and Dennis has copies in DG Wells. Halina Kruk, as I mentioned already, is a poet from Lviv. She's also a professor of medieval literature. She works on kind of medieval poetry. And she's been famous since, she's in her late 40s now. She's been writing since she was a teenager and has been winning awards since the 90s. And so she's a seasoned poet at this point. And her poetry, isn't always about war. Her first poems were sort of more about, pushing gender boundaries, and they were, playing with genre, playing with form, using rhyme kind of to turn against itself sometimes. One of the things I really love about Halina's poetry is that it's poetry that is in some ways kind of defying the genre of poetry. She's constantly questioning whether it's even possible to write poetry in a time of war. She gave a really beautiful speech right at the beginning of the war in Berlin for, I believe, the Berlin Poetry Festival, where she talked about the impossibility of writing, of thinking only about poetry, of thinking only about form during war. And she cited some Russian poets that she knew who would talk about how poetry was supposed to rise above politics. And so she's been very critical of that, and yet she's one of the poets who's continued to write. And in some ways she writes this poetry where you'll be reading it and it'll have a rhyme, it'll have a rhythm, and then suddenly it'll just stop and you'll have a line that's really prosaic sounding. And in our translations of that, we tried to preserve that because it's sort of what people will sometimes call poetry against poetry, poetry that forces you to think about when it's appropriate to be poetic and when you should let that go. This book contains about 65 poems, maybe 64 poems. And we did it, we made it bilingual. It's both available all the poems are available in English or Ukrainian. So if you have any quibbles with our translation, you can translate it again. I believe in having lots of translations of the same poems that are out there. But it also has an introduction to the entire volume. And we decided after a lot of contemplation to order it from the most recent to the furthest away. The oldest poem is from about 2013, so a little bit before the Maidan protest movements which began in the fall of 2013, and before the outbreak of the Donbass War. So I'll start with the opening poem from this volume, and I'll read them in English, but I'll read bits and pieces in Ukrainian after the English where appropriate, and you'll bear with me if I trip over words, since there are probably some native speakers in the room who could correct me easily. I know there are. So the first one is called Bifurcation Point. In wartime Lviv, they'll write later, there was a strong literary milieu. Most likely they published as a group, like those modernists in Lithuania, or gathered for readings, because what else would poets do in wartime? There were so many there, the internally displaced and the externally dysfunctional, like briefly during the First World War and the Second, on their way through Europe, before the Iron Curtain tore the modern world's voluptuous, naked body wide open. Back then it was more about Prague and Poděbrady, Warsaw and Munich, but this time they'll talk about Warsaw and Lviv, Chernivtsi and Uzhhorod, Ivano-Frankivsk and Ternopil, where there were so many of those poets it seemed you couldn't take a step without winding up in each other's poem, in nightmares, in history, in the news, on the floor, sharing a mattress, under a single borrowed patchwork quilt. What a perfect metaphor for human coexistence in wartime. Too bad it's worn out. For one family, fractured and incomplete, then explain to someone how in those first months we only crossed paths accidentally, for a few minutes just on business, sometimes on the street, not acknowledging each other at first. Startling, as if recalling something hopelessly lost and irretrievable, hugging instead of words to hide streaming tears. How are you? How are you? Not a word about literature. Hang in there. Hang in there. Silent and focused, like the first Christians who witnessed Christ's miracles with their own eyes and had no idea how to fathom it, and how to make others believe and not mock them, how not to twist or muddle things, because it's never clear which are the important details and which can be disregarded. Then, in each account, we omit the parts about ourselves, like apostles on opposite ends of the world, each preaching our own version of the gospel, because any faith depends on a million eyewitness accounts, on countless private stories from that point in reality where no one knows anything yet or understands what that man did beside the dead Lazarus. How he did it, Lazarus, how he did it, how everyone saw, but not everyone immediately believed. Especially if this faith in victory comes from a point not yet visible. This is how they'll describe the early 20s in the relevant chapters on Ukrainian literature. The main thing is not to forget that none of this was about literature. So my son is in the audience and we've been reading Tolkien, so I'll read this poem with the title Tudy Nazad, There and Back Again. I actually, originally we had titled this There and Back, Tudy Nazad, that's a normal translation, and then when Halina was going over things, and she doesn't have great English, but she has good enough English that she can catch things, she was like, I think there should be an again. This is supposed to be a reference to Tolkien. So it's like The Hobbit, There and Back Again. That's the name, the subtitle. So, There and Back Again. I traveled there on tranquilizers, back on painkillers. There were no other routes. I felt so shattered, feared I'd pierce the aircraft cabin. The hotel's interior was so intricately designed, the interlocutors' bodies so beautiful. War doesn't suit the rest of the world. Like mutilation with an evening gown. The looks too heavy, the language too sharp, the details too brutal. Let's close death's eyes with your hands, dear. You can reach. You're closer there. You've got a special person. We've got a special person for the hard conversations. We've got a special room. Separate entrance and exit. Not here, please. Beautiful young bodies dive into the canal's waters, sunlit, full of love, life, laughter. Perfect, audacious, like German pre-war postcards, a healthy spirit in a healthy body. Carefully selected grains with no blemishes, as we once were, sure of ourselves, love-filled. In the face of death, I say to you, love me as if there will never be enough light to find each other again. Love me until it seems death's turned a blind eye. But she's spying, from now on, always, everywhere. We know it. we can't finish. The war is taking care of our future, as they say, as they see it. When you call from the war, birds are chirping, so the world still exists. And I should add, Helena was okay with my putting this in the introduction, so I think it's okay to mention it. Her husband has been fighting since the invasion in the east of Ukraine. So many of her poems do express things from that relationship. And he gets time off and they're able to see each other. But I think it's been intense being able to travel all over the place as a poet, being able to leave. She's gotten plenty of invitations to leave, but of course she doesn't want to leave the country at this point since she has to be near her family. I'm going to read a poem about a ficus plant. Because one of the poems that Olga chose for me to read from Khersonskaya is also about a ficus plant. And I think it's interesting that the ficus, this house plant that is so ubiquitous everywhere, has been making it into war poems, right? Why the ficus? I don't know. We can talk about that maybe after. This is called The Story of a Ficus, as told by a human who prefers to communicate with plants. Half a year of war, an abandoned ficus registers the events from the window, dreams of leaving through the window frames, long since empty. But no, an abandoned ficus can't go anywhere, though the missile gave it a glimmer of hope and a sudden urge toward the outside world. Few pages have survived from these chronicles of summer. But if it rains, the ficus fills out. A person will enter the building, squeezing past the door that the shockwave unhinged. Not a home, but an inn. Curtain rolled up by the wind, rooms filled with junk, no clear way out. But the ficus below will survive and send out shoots, leave its broken pot, clasp the black lawn with thirsty roots, stand proud, grow, wait. For its old man's shuffling slippers, heart to hearts, simple plantish pleasures. Mm-hmm. I wasn't going to read this, but I kind of want to. This is a poem about a refrigerator, our unplugged refrigerator. It's from just a couple of months ago. We submitted the final, galleys in late December. So I guess it was more than a couple of, but it was like November that she wrote some of these poems. Our unplugged refrigerator. I love you from all the places. There's still a lot of uncharted territory. You can go on and on until your forehead hits the refrigerator magnets, brought from various countries. We weren't together here or here, and I sent pictures and texts from here, and I called you from there. A spectacular landscape, a yellow-toothed otter, a bamboo forest that just stood and stood, guarding the earth. Then one day it began to grow and shot way up overhead. The list of cities we must see when all this is over has grown so long that I ask myself at dawn in a foreign country, in some hotel, in an uncomfortable bed, will we have enough life left for the whole list? Will we have enough headspace for all that freakish growth? Will we have enough strength for it all? There's one thing you don't have to worry about, you joke. If we run out of space for magnets, we'll buy a bigger refrigerator. I love you from all the places. I return to you from everywhere, like a magnet. This one's called Human Warmth. Choosing a thermal sensor or night vision device, you scroll in wonder through all these models designed for tracking animals and spotting shy birds in the wild, and then, in horror, through those designed for hunting. For neither beast nor bird deserves this, not the elk, not the stiff carcass of a hare, not the delicate body of the roebuck, flashing past the thermal imager, confused and uncertain. Where to flee? Who's in my rightful place? A dog's hot body shows redder than humans. How often did it warm you in the trenches, sheltering from the roaring missiles? The gophers, weasels, moles are so small and unremarkable, they don't count. Taking aim, you must remember. Human warmth is special. It can kill. I'm going to read a short one. I tend to like to read first in English and then in Ukrainian if I'm going to add the Ukrainian. Do you agree that that's a good idea? That way those of you who are English speakers will kind of have the meaning in your head. So I'll read this very short one in both languages. This is called And For This Pain. And for this pain, I can give you no name. And for this pain, I can give you no tears. And wherever we go, it's close on our heels, like subcutaneous horror. like a frozen cry, like one of us. I'm Lot's wife, who looked back at the world one last time. This gives you a little bit of a sense of the occasional rhyme that Kruk uses. She doesn't always rhyme, but she is one of those poets who sometimes does. І для цього болю в мене для вас нема назв, а для цього болю в мене для вас нема сліз. І куди б ми не йшли тепер, він за нами скрізь, як підшкірний жах, як застиглий крик, як один із нас. Я жона Лота, яка востаннє озирнулась на світ. This is a poem called With Europe in the Background, and she wrote this earlier after the invasion last spring, and sent this to us to translate. This is a poem that I was working on actually when Helena arrived at Harvard to give a reading, and so we sat together for about an hour in my office, and had the pleasure of going over it. That's like you get together a translator and a poet. It's such a rare opportunity to do it in person. Not that you can't do it over Zoom, but it's different somehow. And you just look at something together, and it's really beautiful to kind of hear them talk through maybe what was going on in their head with the metaphor. And there was something really, really fortuitous about that meeting because in this poem, there's a description of a practice that was happening for very obvious reasons all around Ukraine, which is that people were taking masking tape, different kinds of tape, and they were putting it around their windows. There was an instruction manual telling people how to do it, making these kind of star shapes. In fact, Ostap Slivinsky in his book, The War Glossary, has star, the word star, and the new meaning of star is these stars that people would talk about, and that they would actually display this light through the shadows of the star on the opposite wall. And the woman who's reporting that particular story says, I hope that will be my only memory of the war. But we were sitting together talking about this taping, right? And I said, I had used the word affixing, I'm not, the poem starts, I'm not blaming you, I'm just affixing, masking tape crosswise and whatever. And she's like, yeah, but fiksuyu, fiksuvate, it has a double meaning in Ukrainian. I don't know, is there a way of getting into English, like both recording something and also affixing something? And it took me like an embarrassingly long minute to be like, taping. Just like, oh, we have a word for that, but we don't use it very much anymore. So I'll read this, and we made it better in time for our reading last year. Okay. With Europe in the background, it's the second part where you get to the tape, so listen for it. To grow old from the news, to go gray from the black smoke, to see through the gaping hole in a burned-out high-rise as Europe's distant sun sets, I'll have to rethink literary history before I teach it to my students. Those who survive will need a different discipline. Those who survive will need a different world. Who will return ours to us? Part 2. I'm not blaming you. I'm just taping over the panes in our large European windows, in our bright European cities, crosswise and around the perimeter. The air raid alarm doesn't leave room for the other kinds of alarm. Don't forget to turn off the gas and the lights, says the radio in my good friend's voice. And I understand he isn't joking. This alarm is already in your air, Europe. Don't forget the gas and the lights. Take us in like bad news. Take us in like unpleasant medicine. Take us in like a premature birth. Whatever's born with you, whatever's born will be yours, however sweet, however bitter. I think that second part I'll read in Ukrainian as well. Я не звинувачую тебе, я тільки фіксую, клейкаю стрічкою скло у наших великих європейських вікнах, у наших світлих європейських містах навхрест і по периметру. Повітряна тривога не залишає місця всім іншим видам тривоги. Не забудьте вимкнути газ і світло, каже радіо голосом моєго доброго знайомого. І я розумію, що він не жартує. Ця тривога вже в твоєму повітрі, Європу. Не забудь про газ і світло. Приймай нас, як погані новини. Приймай нас, як неприємні ліки. Приймай нас, як несвоєчасні пологи. Те, що народиться, буде твоїм. Як це не солодко, як це не гірко. I'm going to move a little bit further back in time, a little bit before the war. This one I may also read parts of in Ukrainian because it's formally very interesting. In fact, I may read the Ukrainian first on this because I'm proud of my managing to do this in English. It's called in Ukrainian Mama Yama Ya. Literally, Mama, I'm a pit, right? Mama, pit, I. Mama Yama Ya. But she's playing a lot with language and with syllables. Mama Yama Ya, де моє ім'я, рама від вікна, хрестовина на, Бог на виліт ішов, душу підібрав. Хірургічний шов, болю автоклав, тіло мовчазне, вигололи дим, не знаходить в ним, прихистку любов. Мама, яма, як, бігти навсходін, плакати навзрід, падати навзнак. Боже, я прийму всі твої шляхи, але їх не руш, але їх залиш, тих услих маслих, що навчилась лиш. Кілька перших слів з материнських уст, з материнних рук. Мама, яма, сам, як йому тепер? Мама, яма, як? Mama, I'm a pit. Mama, I'm a pit. Where's my name? Window frame, crossbeam holding it. God flew out the wound, picking up the soul. Sutures, surgical, autoclave for pain. Body's silent frame, house grown cold. Love can't find in it shelter or accord. Mama, how? A pit. Run till you catch up. Cry aloud, sob. Fallen on your back. God, I accept all your paths. But they can't be moved. But they must be left. All the little ones, only barely learned their first words. From a mother's tongue, from a mother's hands. Mama, pit, self. How's he now? Mama, pit, how? How are we doing for time, Dennis? I'm doing okay? I can read a few more from this one because I want to make sure there's time to read some of these wonderful Kherstonsky poems as well. So I'll turn to a poem that Yulia and I translated long before the invasion, a couple of years before the invasion, called History of the Turn of the Century. Історія початку століття. Fatal and inconsistent as NEP, the new economic policy, for those of you not up on Soviet history, she aims her bangs at you. The poet's muscles are slack like a millstone in 33, but don't give her a word or she'll take them all. You've tried not to let her dazzle you. You've seen these tricks, won't fall for them. Who is she anyway? Flirt? Chaka agent? Bitch? She knows how to hit you where it hurts. That what will kill you will seduce you first. Audacious Ubermensch, how long will you stay standing over the hollowed trench, after a hasty gunshot, over a bullet-marked body where God will never die? This one is called Brainwashing Machine. The neighbors bought a machine that will clean your convictions. They threw in a round head with ears, turned it on, the drum spins over and over. The Oberstandartenführer, old guard general, Hawk, third in the NKVD Troika, walks his dog, gives orders in a clear voice, as if shooting a few millimeters above the head. No one survived. No one lived. No one to testify. All the lower ranks respect strength and discipline. The TV at full blast drowns out all the voices, even the voice of self-preservation. History stubbornly hits one mark, a few millimeters above the head, and then right in the occipital. This one is called A Moment of Truth, or Moment Istine. And I'm really lucky to live with with someone who's a scientist, trained as a physicist, and has a lot of mathematical background. And we had fun together going over some of the vocabulary used for this one. So thank you, Iran. A shout out to you. I'm going to read this in English and then in Ukrainian. Moment of truth. There's no past. There's no future. There are effects of causes. There's a sequence of functions. There's a plane where the square root of evil grows as if to differentiate the whole curve. There's an equality whereby life brings two opposites to zero at best. There's a point at zero where rain falls like a god on parched lips, on an empty stomach. There's an angle that intoxicates, a thousandth that's the main point. A fogged pince nez, numb forearm. There's a light where you can't cast a shadow. There's a bullet flying eternally toward you. Halina really enjoys, you can tell that she enjoys physics and math, and she'll sort of, in addition to her classical training, because you see all this classical references to Trojan horses and things, you'll have like, I don't know, a sequence of functions, and then there's a rabbit hole of math terms to try to bring into a poem. And if any of you are in the know of such vocabulary in Ukrainian, you hopefully will recognize it in the original. Момент істини. Минулого нема, майбутнього нема. Є наслідки причин. Є послідовність значин. Є площина, в якій квадратний корінь зла. Росте і все довкруг. Дискримінує, наче є рівність, при якій із протиставних двох життя рівняє до нуля найкраще. Є точка на нулі, де сходить дощ, як Бог. На пересохли губи, наче є градус, що п'янить, є тисячне, що ціль. Заприли окуляр, затерпле передпліччя, є світло, при яким не відкидаєш тінь. Є куля, що летить у тебе вічність. So maybe Olga appreciates some of the terminology in Ukrainian. Okay, I'll read a couple more from the Kruk book. This one is called Vyshyvanka Day. There's a day that's become kind of popular in Ukraine, celebrating the traditional embroidered items from Ukrainian tradition. And, people will celebrate it in solidarity with Ukraine. I think it's in May. And so she wrote this poem called Vyshyvanka Day around 2014 with a bit of a darker tone. Vyshyvanka Day. We identified our own only by the embroidery, the old woman next door told me, of those shot in 46. There was no other way to identify them, just one big wound, each recognized her own stitching. May none of us ever have to identify our kindred only by the embroidery, I thought then. Not even if there are that many of us, I thought now. This one is called Zhivitsa, or resin, and there's a whole series of play on words. Zhivitsa, the word for resin, the kind of this stuff that comes out of trees, is related actually to the word zhivut, to live, but also to rejoice, to be happy, to live well. And she's playing with it at many levels. Resin. Someday the war will end, and we'll all revive at last. Oh, how we'll revive. We'll heal like wounds. We'll grow back like leg and arm stumps, like an eye's empty socket where it's dark forever. We'll call the dead each name, and they'll all come, and how they'll stare until the blood coagulates like resin. But for now, hold on for dear life to the hawthorn roots. Hawthorn cures the heart, because only the heart holds all of this, and the mind refuses to grasp. This is a poem that Halina wrote right after the slaying of about 100 people on the central Maidan Square in 2014. Some of you may remember that in February 2014 there were snipers up on the roofs of buildings that started to shoot at the protesters. This is called "We Act Like Children with our dead. We act like children with our dead. We place them together on the Maidan and encircle them in the cold, in the snow, confused as if none of us knew until now how easy it is to die. Everyone still hopes they'll lie there for a while and rise again, because what do we tell their mothers? Who will tell them the worst? A person runs toward a bullet with a wooden shield and a warm head in a blood-filled ski helmet, shouting, "Mama, I'm wearing a hat," into a dead receiver. "Mama, his hat's too thin," the bullet hisses. And this is a poem from 2013, which some have read later and thought it a bit prophetic. I dream about a bomb shelter. I dream about a bomb shelter on memory's margins, the last one standing from those grade school war drills. There will never be another war, said the teacher, but children, turn out the lights in the event of a nuclear blast, detonated weapon of mass destruction, or some other incident. You should go down to the bomb shelter without panicking. Take only the essentials, nothing extra. Warm things in case war goes till winter. Kids, you know they don't turn on the heating in bomb shelters. But won't it be hot there anyway? A snide remark hurled from the back row. Hrynovet, it's still unclear they'll even let you in. Not everyone will fit. There are limited water and food supplies. I already know. There's no avoiding panic in Armageddon. How many will be trampled on their way down to the shelter? I can't imagine, God, how you will choose. Every 10,000th? Every millionth? And what margin of error? I believe there will be no discrimination by gender, race, creed. I want to believe this. How many breaths of air for each while they wait for their deus ex machina? Each class, said the teacher, must follow its leader. And mind you, no running in the paths between bunks. Carry a card with your name in your breast pocket. In cursive, not printed like yours, Fedechko. Why not? This still puzzles me. Maybe so the angels who carry souls away because no one will really survive. So the angels in white clothes with the red cross and crescent. So the angels know, little one, how to address you. And the last one I want to read from this book is the earliest in the book, also from, I believe, 2013, and it's called Be Honest with Yourself. Be honest with yourself, honest as you can, like there's nothing left to lose. You've leaned too long on others, so it's written, so folks say. You're so used to embroidered straitjackets, to elaborate church feasts and rites, to flipping the bird behind our backs in defiance. Be straight with yourself. There won't be enough villages and towns left for us all to be peripheral. Not enough soldiers to march single file on the field. Not enough fields, not enough Nanking cloth imported from China. Be ruthless with yourself. No burying your head in the sand. No reaching for your grandfather's glory and the memory of heroes, like you reach for a handkerchief to wipe patriotic tears and snot. No disappearing into some sad song. Tell yourself, I am Ya, last letter in the alphabet, without which there can be no me. I am the last land. I am what I can't give up. I am the carpenter of the beam in my own eye. I need not build across from it if I don't want. I can't give away what isn't mine. I belong to this people. I am this people. I don't want us to walk toward a dead end forever. And so I begin with me, break bounds. I am we, ya, мы, holes in the ground. I'll read just the end of that in the Ukrainian. Сказати собі, я остання буква збитка, без якої мене не буде. Я остання територія. Я те, чого я не можу зректися. Я тесля колоди у власному оці. Я не мушу тесати із неї хреста, якщо не хочу. Я не можу видати того, що мене не належить. Я належу до цього народу. Я – цей народ. Я не хочу, щоб ми до віку ходили такими глухними шляхами. Отже, я починаю від себе. Я розорюю межі. Я – ми. Я – ми. Yamy. Thank you. So this is Halina, really amazing poet who's continuing to write. And in fact, there's another duo of translators that are going to be picking up where we left off and continuing to work on her. So she's worth knowing. I now want to read a couple of things about, from Khersonskaya, or Khersonskaya in the Ukrainian. And I want to say a few words about Khersonskaya. I've already said a couple things for my own purposes about Khersonskaya as someone who's met her in person and who likes her very much and admires her work very deeply. But I want to read her biography, which Olga sent to me today. Lyudmila Khersonskaya is a poet and translator from Odessa. She is the author of 4 poetry collections in Russian. In 2022, her joint volume with the poet Boris Khersonsky, her husband, came out in English translation from Lost Horse Press, titled The Country Where Everyone's Name is Fear. Khersonskaya was recently included in the list 33 international women writers who are bold for change. And that came out with Words Without Borders. And just a short statement from Olga about this book and the project that she edited and co-translated with 3 other translators. Almost all of these poems were originally published on Khersonskaya's Facebook page, where they were immediately read, commented on, and shared. The book is shaped by the immediacy of the ongoing war and of these poems posted and processed by an international community. They had a huge impact on the poems on the translators when they first were written. The poems had a huge impact on the translators when they were first written. A year later, after the necessary time it takes to translate and publish in print, the war is still going on, and with it, the trauma, compassion, and desire to be of help. The poems still have this impact on the translators. And she wanted me to just note a couple of themes as well that come up in Khersonskaya's writing. There's this idea of disruption. And we see this in Kruk as well, but this disrupted everyday life, which is huge, kind of a disrupted domesticity. We don't have a bomb shelter. What are we going to do? Where are we going to go? What's going to happen to the ficus plant? What's going to happen to the cats? And so forth. She has these poems that are kind of dated War, Day 1, Day 2, Day 300. So this is War, Day 1. And it's translated by, they just have the initials of the translators, and I have to remember all of the full names of the translators so that I can share those. I guess they're in the back of the book. Yes. Okay. So this first one is translated by Olga Livshin together with Andrei Yanko. Or Day 1. In the morning, rockets sang outside the window instead of birds. She tumbled out of bed in her cheery pajamas, ran across the chilly floor like a blue sky, barefoot. What is this red blob flying outside the window? What is this? So frightening. Flying over our heads towards a peaceful morning with such a demonic whistle. Why are these clear glasses shaking, the clear soul shaking? Why is she trembling? So the war is here. No one asked it for a visit. No one made its bed or set the table with a snow-white tablecloth. How would she wash blood drops off the white linen fabric? Is this war? She asked the closed door, barefoot in her cheery pajamas. What a guest, uninvited and scary. I won't open up, won't treat it to a good meal or put on my nice dress. Don't open, the door boomed. Don't feed it or put on your pretty dress. If it forces its way in, hit it with an axe. Buried in a human neck, a bullet. Buried in a human neck, a bullet looks like an eye sewn in, an eye looking back at one's fate. Who shot him there? Who gave the order? Which man? Who will bury him? And what's the rate? When it comes to humanity, war is the beginning and end. Whoever attacks you, don't turn your back. Says the Lord, for my people are foolish. They have not known me. They are silly children and they have no understanding. But the children feel as strong as their machinery, mass-produced, with plenty of menders for repairing. Some ladies patch holes, others fix neck bones. Still more sew on buttons that were torn away from hands. And the Lord says, they are wise in doing evil, but, says the Lord, they do not know how to do good. But the children, if they survive, say it was luck. If they die, they think that was yesterday. Today is another day. And the menders stand with a shroud telling them, put this on. How long must we put up with the flags, the trumpets calling us into the fray? What beast has awakened? Where did our special forces land? Who shot that man in the back? Who gave the command? Who will bury him? And what's the rate? This next poem is called War, Day 4, also translated by Olga Livshin and Alex Yanko. On the eve of the war, I bought rhododendrons. I went out to plant them. Over our roof, drones, an air raid siren is buzzing, the air defense pounding. It's nothing. I am not scared. I'll have time to plant. It's nothing. The tiny cat grew huge with raised fur from the loud crash. Music pours in from the window, a cantata by Bach. The sun peeks from the sky, a drone flies, somebody else's ugly things thump from every side. What is this rattling beast that shoots and shoots? What bald Putin celebrates this war like some satanic marriage? Shame, disgust. Someone with horns, someone who needs a slingshot. I planted my plant, watered it, squinted at the evil heaven. Wherever you are, bald demon, I wish you weren't. You old-fashioned, retrograde, cunning narc. Gramps from the past, a cop's used-up cigarette butt. Why the hell would I need your planes? Your bombs, snouts, pilots. I live here. It's here that I plant flowers. And your war in these parts is a weird alien creature. I breathed. I waited. I watched. The birds fly away from their execution by firing squad. I still don't know. How can I try? How will we get the little devils to die? The translators of this one, Olga and Andy, feel that this theme of the disrupted and violated everyday life is incredibly important, especially here. And this poem sort of touches on the whole form of the book, which is the diary of the war. And Olena Jennings, in her really beautiful review of this book when it first came out, wrote, "This poem is one in a series chronicling the days of war. However, many days are missing, as if to suggest that they remain hidden to the world. The poems enumerating the days of war don't fall one after another." So she'll sort of have a poem, day 1, and then more poems, and then day 4. And I wanted to then read this poem, Buried in a Human Neck, a Bullet. And this touches on another theme of Khersonska's, which is that war is a kind of perennial phenomenon, and that in many ways this war echoes past wars, especially World War II. And this poem, which was also translated by Andriy and Olga, is a poem that deals with sort of humanity, this general question of humanity. How do we reclaim that at a time of war? So this is on page 15. Buried in a human neck, a bullet. I just read this. I'm not going to reread it. I could read it in Russian if you'd like me to, though. Shall I read the Russian for those who are Russian speakers in the room? I'll do that, yeah. Sorry, I'm looking at this for the first time, but here goes. Пуля в человеческой шее выглядит как вшитый глаз, как будто человек смотрит глазом из затылка своей судьбы. Кто стрелял в спину? Кто отдавал приказ? Кто будет хоронить и почем гробы? Все человеческое начинается и заканчивается войной. Кто бы ни заступал, не поворачивайся спиной. Говорит Господь, это от того, что народ мой глуп. Не знает меня, неразумные они дети, и нет... Неразумные они дети, и нет смысла у них. А дети думают, что они крепкие, как броня, что их массово шьют, и на всех хватит портних. Эти латают дыры, шивают шейные позвонки, пришивают оторванные пуговицы от руки. А Господь говорит, они умные, назло, но, говорит Господь, не умеют делать добра. А неразумные дети, если выживут, думают, повезло. А если умрут, думают, это было вчера. А сегодня уже другой день. опорники стоят с покрывалом и говорят: «Надень». Долго ли видеть знамя, слушать звуки трубы? Что за зверь пробудился? С кем воюет Стрецнав? Кто стрелял в спину? Кто отдавал приказ? Кто будет хоронить и почем гробы? Почем гробы? This is what happens when you start to mix your Ukrainian and your Russian and you're an American. Okay, a couple of others from the Khersonskaya book, and then I'd love to take any questions. Okay, this is page 24. This is a poem translated by Maya Chabra. And, you know, Khersonskaya, she sometimes writes sort of sarcastically about exile. She and her husband, Boris Khersonsky, left at some point in the early summer for a residency in Italy. You know, this is something a lot of people have done who've been able to leave because of, you know, age or circumstance or health or profession. And she's written kind of ironically about what it means to be out of the country. What does it mean to be sort of watching this now from afar, and also watching other refugees try to seek shelter and normalcy. So in a different country. In a different country, there's sun and a cafe down the block. In my country, the enemy has turned everything upside down. Ruining, breaking, undoing, he keeps us up at night. Sleeping in another country is like a stranger's bed. Dogs wailing, cats hugging the ground. Long ago, the cat learned to hear mice in the walls. Now rockets teach him to sit, immobile and sick. In my country, a person waits. Where will it fall? The rocket of death, will it fly overhead or hit the bullseye? In another country, a dad carries a daughter in his arms. In my country, he carries a weapon to protect her from the enemy. Olga writes here, finally, there's a strong current of poems that explore the apparent inhumanity or extreme cruelty of the enemy. And one example of this is Russian Invader, Who's Forgotten All Chivalry. This is also translated by Maya Chabra. Russian Invader, Who's Forgotten All Chivalry. Fear female revenge and female conspiracy. Fear Ukrainian girls, Molotov cocktails in hand. Fear our women, above all in this strange foreign land. They didn't call or invite you. They weren't waiting for you. Keep an eye on your obsolete tank. They'll unscrew the pedals, rip off your mask, scratch off your face. Our long nails are the latest in fashion and grace. Our slender fingers accustomed to kitchen complexity. That's harder than your dumb vehicles, to give you apoplexy, to strike you dead in the house that is someone else's home, to keep you under the rubble of the bombed-out airdrome, to stop you getting out of the tank, put you in a cervical collar. In a Ukrainian woman's home, there's a working dishwasher, an iron on the table, a slow cooker with a steam valve. But you know nothing but shooting, nothing of salve. Our women bind up wounds. Their camouflage nets unfurl to fight you, you fool. In a foreign country, alone in the world, to turn your uncleansed life into an eternal torment of shame. We ignored Solovyov and read Kafka and Kierkegaard by name. Remember, we'll forgive nothing, you scumbags. So flee your fate. We're painting our nails now. Get out of here before it's too late. Okay, I think that's a good time to take questions.
If you're going to take questions, is Christopher Briscoe in the audience? Chris is just back from assignment in Africa, but he's been to Ukraine 2 or 3 times, and he's written
you're the author of this beautiful book.
War correspondent and photojournalist.
Thank you for, we're so distracted, especially in America. When I was there the first couple of weeks, then it was Who Slapped Who at the Oscars, and then Johnny Depp came along, and everyone's attention went this way, and it's all of these stories, all of these poems need to be heard over and over again. They say that, obviously we all die once, but what's really a tragedy is when we die twice, and that's when we are forgotten. That's why I wrote my book, and that's why those beautiful poems are out there. And, it's so important that you're here.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, lots of different poets that you've heard from. So, just to review again, Lyudmila Khersonskaya, the Russian language poet who's living and writing primarily in Odessa, although she's been out of the country. I think she's planning on returning soon. Halina Kruk, who is based in Lviv in Western Ukraine. And then you've also heard from both Ostap Slivinsky and Iakiva, as well as Mariana Savka in Ilya and Carolyn's volume.
I find it that during, starting from 2004, when the Orange Revolution occurred, that Ukrainians were very prolific with music. But I've never heard of so much of this happening during any other war. And I haven't touched upon poetry as much, but children's books, yes, because there are children's books that are written about the war now. Is it unusual or is it more common?
I think we read poems from wars. We read Paul Celan, and in fact, Ostap Slivinsky has said, he gave a really beautiful poetry reading at a virtual Slavic conference recently, and was saying that the only literature he could read when the war broke out were World War II, like Holocaust poets. So we do have a little bit of a precedent for that. But I believe that there was an explosion of Ukrainian poetry happening before the war and even before the Maidan, which picked up pace. And I don't know exactly how to explain it. I think part of it is Ukrainian is a language that has always lent itself to poetry. I think moments when Ukraine is coming into its own as a country have been moments when poets have been very important and have stepped up. And you have some of the music that's happening right now is also music by people who are essentially poets. I mean, Serhiy Zhadan is perhaps the sort of poet laureate of Ukraine, a really wonderful poet and also novelist from Kharkiv, who is also a rock star, like a mega rock star. And, Slava Vakarchuk, who is the lead singer in Okean Elzy, is also quite really a poet in his own right. Alyona is really a hip hop artist. So I think there's overlap. But I do think going back to Shevchenko, who's the poet, the great Ukrainian romantic poet, for those who aren't familiar with the history of Ukrainian literature of the 19th century, there's this idea that, well, Ukraine may not exist as a geographic entity right now, but we have this poetry that defines it. And so I think there was a moment, really maybe after I don't want to say re-election, the election of Yanukovych in 2010, when there was an intellectual vanguard that was stepping up and kind of writing about what it meant to be Ukrainian. And I don't want to say it's linked to the election of Yanukovych. That would be sort of perverse. But there's been a lot happening in since the beginning of the 21st century in Ukraine, from the Orange Revolution on up, and poets have emerged. And I don't know if it's entirely political. I don't want to credit it just to politics. I think it's also, there are networks of East European poets that have been kind of strengthening maybe since the rise of online poetry as well. And many people have talked about how internet communities have helped poetry to regain a footing as a genre. We have music and we have novels and we have other genres, but poetry as a genre, we kind of thought it was disappearing, and then it turns out it wasn't. It was becoming really strong again, the short form piece of writing. So you have these really strong East European circles of poets that are maybe the heirs to the dissident tradition, coming out of Eastern Europe, and they would gather at festivals, meet each other, and then stay friends on Facebook and translate each other between, especially Ukrainian and Polish, or Ukrainian and Belarusian. And these circles would, you see it happening around 2014. These circles started to center on Ukraine. Ukraine would become kind of a hub. People would be translating from Ukrainian into Ukrainian. And part of it is just that you have a lot of really good poets in Ukraine. But it started to, I think things were sort of maybe shifting out of Russia towards Ukraine in this world of poetic communities. And I don't want to fully connect it to politics, even though I don't think it's possible to completely disconnect it. I think part of it is just the movement of art.
Now we have the problem of sports and politics. do you think that, okay, poetry in this case, can it serve politics? Can it stand with it, against it? Should it be a part of it? Or should it be totally divorced from? It's art. It's not politics. That kind of. What do you think?
This is what Kruk was reacting against in the speech that she gave at the Berlin Poetry Festival, where she had remembered this conversation from the very beginning of the Donbass War, when she was on a panel with a Russian poet who said, "We're artists, don't we rise above politics?" And she was saying, "Oh, you can rise above politics. I can't. I'm in a country that's at war. You're in a huge country where people are sort of coming into my country to wage war and to capture parts of it." And so, she's basically saying, no, you can't write poetry. And yet here she is writing poetry. So you can't only write poetry. And I think that's the message that a poet like Kruk is giving, is that, to say that you're just off doing your thing and that you're not implicated is to sort of, give up a lot of power that you could have as a voice for good.
Would you include, poetry,
sports,
literature, fine arts, music? Would you
Yeah.
include all of those?
I mean, it's been just look at, it was, in Mariupol, the conductor of the Philharmonic was shot for refusing to perform at an event for Russia. I think if you are being invaded, I think you're implicated, you're in it. And that's what most of these poets are standing up saying. And much of my field is Russian studies. My job is, I'm a professor of Russian literature. I am seeing a moment of crisis in my field, because there are many in Russia who are saying, but we're not for the war, we're just poets, we're just doing our thing. Mm-hmm. And then the question becomes, so how much airspace do we give? And what does that involve? So I don't have a good answer, except to say that.
Just picking your brain.
No, I mean, I think you're entering a conversation that is really active right now. Do you have to be talking about politics if you are a poet? Sure. And if you're in Ukraine, you have no choice, because that's also the day-to-day. That's also your ficus plant. Like, your ficus plant has become political.
Is that also a weapon? A poet's weapon is his or her poetry.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I tend to agree that I think, poets are very powerful. And if they're right well, they have a lot. They have a chance to move hearts and minds.
In the window, I've seen them. I've seen them.
And that may be the pictures that you've seen. Some of these poems, they're very, they're like ekphrastic poems that are written based on art. You see these ekphrastic poems that are written based on photojournalism. So you'll see there's a horrifying picture of a woman's painted fingernails that circulated for a while in Ukraine, and there were a lot of poems about that image. The poems of the picture of the ficus. I just translated a poem by Iya Kiva about the building that was bombed, where you could just see the bowl of apples. And so, people will, it's almost a way, it's a photograph of a photograph. It's a way of putting into words what's happening right now. So to answer your question, personally, I think being a poet at a time of war is incredibly political, and it also can be incredibly powerful.
Are there Russian poets who are engaged in this process? And what do you think about that?
There are Russian poets who have been writing a lot about the war in Ukraine. Most of them have left Russia. Most of them are living in places like Armenia or Georgia or Germany, or some Ukraine. There are a couple of Russian poets who have actually moved to Ukraine right after the invasion. Not an easy thing to do. There's also, there are a couple of poets who happen to be married to each other, Arkady Shtipil and Masha Galina, who moved to Odessa, where she was her family was from there originally, in 2014. And so they've continued to write in Russian, and to write about being Russians living in Ukraine, but also to kind of write about being Ukrainian, living in Ukraine. It's very easy to say, well, those Russians, they've had their turn, and it's time to focus just on Ukrainians right now. But there's a lot of people with family members in both places, And, for Russian poets to express solidarity is incredibly important. At this point, my own focus has been on Ukrainian poets because I have the ability to translate them, and I feel that there already was a dearth of Ukrainian poetry, and it's time to just get that out there to flood the English publishing sphere with this really good poetry that deserved to be here a long time ago. There's some very good Russian poetry. Some of it I find a little bit kind of, woe is me, like, I don't have as much kind of personal feeling of connection to it, but there are a lot of Russian poets who are writing in it. And in fact, I'll add, I've just read a beautiful thesis by an undergraduate student who wrote this thesis for me about Russian poets who are posting to social media. And she's looking at how language changes, how the war has changed their language. And she's, in a very, very thoughtful, nuanced way, she's created, and this is something I've been working with the student to create a database of Ukrainian poetry for a long time. So she also did this with Russian. And she's been looking in a very thoughtful way at how war has changed the language of Russians. Mm-hmm. And, she can't make any predictions about what that might mean for the future. But I do think it's worth reading what some of these Russian poets are writing to get a sense of the actual public opinion around the war, since that's kind of hard to get right now. But I, some of my students who are Russian speakers have been translating some Russian poetry, and they've been doing a really beautiful job with it. So we're trying to get some of that circulating out there.
Thank you for bringing those poems to an English-speaking audience. But why you selected those poets? There are many different poets. Why selected those?
So many poets. Why these? So I didn't select Khersonskaya, although I totally endorse the selection of Khersonskaya because she's amazing. She's a wonderful, wonderful poet who's been publishing for years in Russian but hasn't made it very much into English. I've been translating a lot of different poets. My colleague Yulia and I, as I mentioned at the beginning, have been given kind of it's a really lovely thing, this platform on the website LitHub, or Literary Hub, where we've published 10 or 11 the works of 10 or 11 different poets from Ukraine. And our goal has been to really foreground the ones that speak the most to us. So the poets that we've included, I'll see if I can remember all of them in order. Iya Kiva, who's she's young, I mean, she's like in her late 30s, but she started to write in Russian as a young person living in Kharkiv, in Donetsk. And then after the Donbass War broke out, she became a refugee to Kyiv, and she switched to Ukrainian and started to write in Ukrainian, but still sometimes writes in Russian. And then when the invasion happened a year ago, she was outside of Kyiv and couldn't get back in. So she had to become a refugee a second time over to Lviv. So she was the first poet that we published, really, really interesting person who writes about kind of her multiple background. She's sort of part Russian, part Ukrainian, part Jewish. She has all these different sides to her. She translates from Polish. Then Serhiy Zhadan, Boris Khersonsky, the husband of Lyudmila Khersonskaya, Ostap Slivinsky, who's the one compiling the war dictionary, Halina Kruk, Katerina Kalitko, who's a Vinnytsia-based poet, and just published, she's about to come out with a novel in Ukrainian about the Holocaust in Vinnytsia, which I kind of want to get my hands on and translate into English. Mariana Savka, a poet who is also an artist in Lviv. Irina Shuvalova, a poet who is from Kyiv but lives until very recently was living in China teaching with a teaching gig. Mariana Kionovska, who has been writing for many years in Western Ukraine, and I'm going to forget, there's one more, I'm sure. I know there's a 10th, so it'll come to me. So we haven't chosen. The answer is we haven't done a very good job of choosing. We've been translating everybody. And in part, because of this, because there are so many writing in Ukrainian, this is what's led me to start this database with my students, where we're actually entering as many poems as possible that we can find on Facebook into a database of Ukrainian poems where you can search it by theme. And then together, my students and I have been kind of going through and translating some of them, since so many are so good. But why, I'm dodging your question. Why these? Kruk spoke to me with her incredible, almost sort of surgical precision of taking one moment in a war and then cutting to the heart of what that means about sort of humanity more generally. And every poem she writes it has this very clean, almost painfully clean message that she's that she's pushing through with her, with this moment that she's describing, whether it's taping the windows, right, that are facing Europe, and Europe's now implicated, or the heat sensor, right, the infrared heat sensor. And what is it about human warmth that's different from animal warmth? And I think it's her mixture of science and of medieval history and language. And I really like the way she plays with rhyme. You'll notice that I don't really do rhyme in the translations, but I try to suggest it. That also really, really appeals to me. So as a poet, I find her to be just a very, very interesting one to watch. The other poet that we're working on a full-length book for right now is Iya Kiva, this one from Donetsk. And she's very different, much more complex. She has these complicated lines where it'll be like a metaphor of a metaphor of a metaphor. And each poem we translate by Kiva is like a little puzzle, just trying to work out, kind of trying to pull the thread. But again, it's poetry that contains within it a very harsh version of reality, a very harsh truth that I feel as an American I needed to hear and I needed to try to understand. And I think that's the poetry that I'm compelled to bring into English. So, thank you for your question. I answered it in a much more long-winded way than I needed to, I realize. Questions.
Bravo.
Thank you all so much for being here, for listening. I'm happy to sign copies of books or recommend other poets.
Thank you, Amelia.